Congratulations! You are tuned into Dov Baron's Leadership and Loyalty Show, the #1 podcast for Fortune 500 executives and those who are dedicated to creating a quantum leap in leadership. Your host, Dov Baron, he's an executive mentor to leaders like you, a contributing writer for Entrepreneur Magazine, CEO World, and he's been featured on CNN, Fox, CBS, and many other notable sites. Dov Baron is an international business speaker who was named by Inc. magazine as one of the top 100 leadership speakers to hire. Now, over to Dov Baron.
Welcome, dear friends, fans, and fellow aficionados of leadership excellence. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Leadership and Loyalty Tips for Executives. I'm your host, Dov Baron. I'm here to assist you tapping into the one thing in your business that changes everything by transforming meaning into action. Curious to know more? Simply go to dovbaron.com. Let me ask you, do you sometimes feel like when you go to work, you have to leave other parts of yourself behind? Since the beginning of the industrial age, we've all received this message that we've got to somehow separate our personal lives from our professional lives. And we've been indoctrinated into doing that. But just stop for a moment and consider that the people who have influenced you the most in business have likely also influenced other areas of your life. And maybe the people who influence you in other areas of life have also influenced you in business. So maybe it's time for us to open up to the understanding that we all need mentors, and we need them in all areas of our lives. We'll talk more about that in a moment. As always, we need your help in staying relevant. So please do us a favor, get over to wherever you tune into the podcast and rate, review, and subscribe to the show. Share it with everybody you know. We really appreciate it. And you know what? When we get those reviews in, every now and then we give you a shout out. And so look for your own name. If you are a regular listener, big thank you for making us the #1 podcast globally for Fortune 500 listeners. We are honored and grateful to be cited by Inc.com as the #1 podcast to make you a better leader. All right, let's strip it down and dive right in. Our guest for the next 2 episodes is Scott Jeffrey Miller. He is a Wall Street Journal bestselling author and currently serves as Franklin Covey, you may have heard of them, small company, senior advisor on thought leadership. He's a highly sought after speaker, author, and podcast host. Before being in the advisory role, Scott was 25 years with Franklin Covey Associates, serving as Chief Marketing Officer and Executive Vice President. He's the author of Management Mess, which is a series of business books like Management Mess for Business Success. And he also hosts On Leadership with Scott Miller. This is the world's largest weekly leadership podcast. I've been on there. It's amazing. He's an amazing host. And if you haven't tuned into it, I recommend you do. We'll put the connection in the show notes. Most recently, Scott has written a series of books entitled Master Mentors, where he's taken mentoring from some of the greatest minds to show us how we can excel in all areas of our lives. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and welcome prolific author and mentor, returning champion, Mr. Scott Miller!
The applause, the roar is deafening. Dov, I'm honored. Thanks for the platform and the spotlight. Looking forward to an engaging discussion today.
Always love talking to you, mate. You're an incredibly bright man, a very kind man, and you do some pretty amazing work in the world. So, where I always like to start with these shows is, we can all come up with the strategies and we talk about the strategies and do this and do that. But I am a deep believer, my work has shown me over the last 30 odd years, that if we're not connected to something deeper within ourselves that gives our lives meaning, it all feels pretty empty at the end of the day. So what is the origin story that gives your life meaning?
Well, 2 words, Agnes Miller, my paternal grandmother, my father's mother, who passed 15 years ago. Fairly typical Catholic German grandmother living in Minnesota, and through a series of very unfortunate tragedies in her life, taught me the value of generosity and having an abundance mentality. And so I'd love to share more about that. But Agnes Miller, who I was not especially close to, it's kind of hard to be close to a German Catholic grandmother who lived 15 states away, right? We lived in Florida and she was in Minnesota, but she taught me one particular very valuable lesson that's given me great meaning in my life.
Tell us about that.
Well, so she was one of 14 children born very much like Little House on the Prairie back at turn of the century in 1905. And they all lived and worked on the farm. And she lost 3 of her brothers to different farming accidents through many years growing up. I think she may have finished 8th grade, which was fairly long for a female farm daughter up in Minnesota.
Absolutely.
And she got married and had 2 twin sons, one of which was my father and his brother. Mm-hmm. Well, when they were 10 years old, her husband, my dad's dad, died of cancer and left her a widow with 2 twin sons.
Wow.
And then shortly after that, my father's twin brother caught polio. Now, if you remember, polio was like COVID times 100. You didn't go to the grocery store and wear a mask. You didn't leave your home because it was like the plague, and it took millions of people's lives. Typically, younger people left them paralyzed or disfigured or disformed. Well, my father's twin brother caught polio at about age 12 and spent many years in an iron lung and eventually succumbed to it.
Wow.
But that's not the point of the story. The story is,
this one's clearly not got an easy start.
Not gotten easy. Lost 3 brothers to farm accidents, lost her husband 10 years in, lost one of her 2 sons in his late teens. And the point of the story is my grandmother was a member of the local Catholic Church. And by the way, this is a time where Catholics and Protestants walked to school on opposite sides of the street, like Northern Ireland in Minneapolis, Minnesota.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I get it.
And one day, the Knights of Columbus, a very famous Catholic service organization, stopped by my grandmother's home and knocked on the door. And I'm getting emotional telling the story because they knocked on the door and they offered to pay for the iron lung for my uncle, who I never met, who died before I was born. And my grandmother, who did not have the means to say no, told the Knights of Columbus, I can cover it. Go next door. The Protestants have a daughter who needs it more than I do. Now, it's not so much about the Catholic Protestant thing. This is a time when my grandmother could not afford it, but she was raised with a social conscience and an abundance mentality. And she told me this story in my 20s in a very sort of lowbrow, non-self-serving way. And I just thought, through all the tribulation that my grandmother had been through and the trauma and tragedy of losing her husband and her quite frankly, favorite son was dying, that she told the Knights of Columbus, go give my contribution that you're going to give me, go give it to them. Give it to them. Take care of them. And I just thought I want to just
put a pause in that for a minute, Scott, because I don't know if you actually know this, but I'm part of an organization called Starts With Us. I don't know if you know what that is. It was started by Daniel Lubetsky of Kind Bars. And it's about getting away from this massive polarization we have and how do we come together. And I'm involved in it. People like Adam Grant are involved in it. Many of my good friends are involved in it. It's a wonderful organization, and we're all doing everything we can to bring people together. Your grandmother, that story is a profound example of it starts with us. I don't have the money. I need what you're offering me.
Yeah.
Give it to my enemy. Yeah. Because essentially, you and I both know this because I grew up in the UK. Yep. The Irish Catholics and the Protestants were like, these were enemies. There was a war for many, many years that I remember, shit blowing up around.
Yeah.
And she says, give it to my enemy.
Yeah.
That's not just generosity. People say, oh, that's a generous person. No, that's beyond generosity.
That's humanity.
That's deep humanity.
Yeah.
That teaches us that we can all go, hold on a sec. I don't talk to you because you wear a red hat. Well, I don't talk to you because you have piercings on your face. Hold on a sec. Where's the humanity? Thank you for that story. Thank you, because that is profound.
Fast forward 40 years.
Yeah.
My grandmother lived till she was 97.
Wow.
Fast forward 40 years into her 80s, a tornado came to her town and wiped half of the town out,
Wow.
including her 50-year-long Catholic church. So for 4 years, all the Catholics ended up meeting on Sundays and having mass in the local Protestant church, and they were open to their arms. And so I think it was later in my grandmother's life, in her late 80s, did it kind of come full circle to see a community coming together. And it took, an act of nature, an act of God to make that happen. A lot of things to unpack there in life.
But what a great example. One of the questions I ask people all the time is, who has been your greatest mentors? And people will tell me, somebody like, their dad, their mom, whoever it was. But oftentimes it's people we didn't have a relationship with.
Yes.
Like, I can honestly say that Oprah's been a mentor to me.
Sure.
Right? I've never met the woman. I would love to meet her, but I've never met her. She doesn't even know I exist, I'm sure, right? But she's mentored me. I've taken lessons from her. There are others too, of course. But, your grandmother who, as you said, 15 states away, living in a very different world than you, has such a profound impact on the meaning of your life.
Yeah.
Like, what a great lesson for all of us to embrace. How are you mentoring? Like, my life's purpose goes like this. I am here to impact the lives of people whose names I will never know and who will never know my name. That's your grandmother.
Well, and you just said the definition of mentorship. I think so many of us make the mistake of limiting it. We think our mentor needs to be the CFO on the 7th floor or someone over in operations. And that's a good process. If your company offers that, by all means, take advantage of it. But to your point, my greatest mentors have no idea I'm even alive, right?
Exactly.
Whether they were radio host or podcast host or famous authors or speakers, I choose to make them my mentor and take from them what will make my life better. I love your definition of expanding the concept of mentorship.
So thank you. I really appreciate it. So you've written this book, which is Master Mentors. Actually, let me rephrase that. This series of books that's going to be a series of 10, as we talked about. How have you defined mentor? Because the books are pretty non-specific.
Yeah.
They cover things like parenting and business strategy, work ethic. They're not all in a particular category. So how are you framing mentor for those people who are picking up that book?
Well, it's pretty specific. So like you, I am privileged to host a fairly popular podcast. My set's behind me. And as you mentioned in the opening, you were also one of our featured guests of our first 250. But what I realized, Dove, is that oftentimes what the guest said, the most profound piece was off air, was like in the green room before we taped or in the last 5 minutes when everybody stopped listening. And so with the permission of some of the guests and with the support of HarperCollins, I've written this series called Master Mentors. And the criteria to be featured in the book, where I feature 30 mentors in each chapter, is one, did you appear in the podcast? Two, did you say something transformational, something that I thought people could benefit from? And three, did you give me permission to feature you in the book? So like you said, they're very episodic by choice. There's no one topic. I highlight people like Seth Godin and Dave Hollis, and the famous psychiatrist Susan David and Dr. Daniel Amen and Ryan Holiday, and Oprah's partner, Stedman Graham, is a good friend of mine. So maybe someday I can hook you up and you can meet your mentor. But they're very episodic. It's basically around what role are you playing in life? And could one of these 30 mentors give you some insight on being a better parent, being a better entrepreneur? Perhaps you've lost your job or lost your life partner or lost your meaning. They're fairly chicken soup for the soul-ish. They're light, they're easy, they're breathe easy. And each book features 30 new mentors on my way to 10 for a total of 300. I expect I will probably feature you with your permission in volume 4 or volume 5. So our attorney will be contacting you for
Thank
permission.
you. Very honored for that. So let's just put this out there for a minute. You're putting these books out. You've got this great following around leadership. As I said, that it's the most widely listened to leadership podcast. What is the response from people who see you in the framework of leadership And then you're having these mentors who are talking about parenting, for instance. What's the response to that?
Well, certainly post-pandemic, I think it's been phenomenal because all of us have reassessed our values in life since this carnage that visited everybody. We know the phrase is true. Everyone was in the same storm, but not everyone was in the same boat. Some people's boats were more down and tied up and more so than others. But I think it's been extremely positive. I also had a mindset shift. I think during the pandemic, I realized that, Dove, for the first half of my career, I metaphorically had the spotlight shining on me. And if it wasn't, I went up and I shined it on me. And then I realized, I want to spend the last half of my life shining whatever spotlight I have, the platform, the podium, the microphone onto others. And I think it came from the sobering realization that, Dove, I'm not sure that I have ever had an original thought in my life. In fact, statistically, most of us haven't ever had an original thought. But once I came to grips with that, I thought, that's probably true. But what I do well is I aggregate and I can pollinate. So my books are merely helping people get access to great authors, Arianna Huffington, Deepak Chopra, and Ryan Holiday, and Seth Godin, and Liz Wiseman, and Susan Cain, guests, many of which you've had on your podcast, and share about them. Hey, read their book, subscribe to their podcast. And so I think the response has been well, because I see them all as mentors, formal or informal. And so it's been better than I expected.
Yeah, that's really good to hear. I mean, I think that we get sort of narrow-minded or narrow-focused, and that has its use, of course, about what leadership is, but we don't understand. I mean, you and I talked about this off-air before, which is, what is leadership? Leadership is permission by example. So it's what I do is the example that gives you permission to do something else. And so by really paying attention to these mentors and being discerning about it at the same time, because you can literally have a great business mentor who's terrible at parenting, but you may have a great business mentor who's a fabulous parent, and you would never know that. And that's what's wonderful about this work. I
think you can also have a great leader who's not a great mentor. As I'm writing a new book for HarperCollins coming out in June of 2023 called The Ultimate Guide to Great Mentorship. And the premise of the book is really just to make sure that as a mentor, you're not working with your mentee ever saying, well, if I was you, or when I did that, because as a mentor, you don't have the same talents and same passions and fears and opportunities as your mentee made. You have got to separate yourself, not from a relationship standpoint, but to understand what you do well may not be replicable for them. What you do poorly may be their sweet spot, but to help to be vulnerable, a talent that both mentors and leaders have, which is to show vulnerability, to say, hey, when I was faced with a similar decision, here was my thought process based on what I had as my skills and fears. To the extent any of that is reasonable or relatable, what do you think you should do? And so mentorship shares in similarities and great differences in a lot of leadership skills.
So when you think about that, I talked before about these mentors who don't know we exist and vice versa. So when you think about that, who is somebody who, I'm going to use this term, accidentally mentored you? What I mean by that is aside from your grandmother, of course, but somebody who had a massive impact, not telling you what to do, but mentoring you, and they didn't even know that they'd done it.
Yeah, I can tell you exactly. It validates your point. So the Dove Baron of the 70s and 80s was a man named Bruce Williams. He was a very famous U.S. radio personality. He really was the first original talk radio host. In fact, his program was called TalkNet. And as a young teenager living in Orlando, Florida, for almost every night for 10, 12 years, I would fall asleep listening to his radio program. It ran from 6 to 9 p.m. Now, we went to bed early in the Miller house. And while most of my friends were listening to NXS and YouTube and Chaka Khan, I was listening to Bruce Williams. He had a talk show where he was kind of like, Dove Barron meets Sean Hannity meets Dave Ramsey, right? He talked about, politics and corporations and how do you build your credit score and how to get an attorney and what is the difference between, private mortgage insurance and this kind of insurance. And it was just an educational program. He was a small town entrepreneur and mayor. And so for the better part of a decade, I just absorbed all of this knowledge. I went into college and went into business without an MBA, but with thousands of hours of listening to this wise guy, this Dove Barron of the 70s and 80s, taking just callers, calling in all the time with different things. I had an inheritance this week. What should I do with it? I'm thinking of buying a home, but my current home isn't paid off. I'm thinking of launching a business, or buying. You get the point. He just gave broad, good, common sense business advice. And you could say it was accidental. What was a 12-year-old doing listening to a business radio program for 3 hours a night for a decade? But all that absorption, I think, put me a step ahead of my peers. And I entered business with a little more business acumen.
Yeah.
And maybe business maturity, maybe not personal maturity, but business maturity. And so for Bruce Williams, I kind of dedicate the introduction to my hats off to you.
That's fantastic.
He had a massive accidental, or maybe not so accidental, impact in my life.
Well, there's another piece that I talk about that I think is right with what you're talking about, because, here you are listening to Bruce Williams for all those years, but how long have you run the podcast that you've done for Franklin Covey?
250 episodes, so a little over 4 years.
Right, so 250 of these amazing human beings that you've had these wonderful conversations with. You can't tell me you don't change the flavor of the steak by what it's marinating in. You are marinating in each of those people.
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah.
You marinated in Bruce Williams for 10 years.
Yeah.
And you've marinated in all these wonderful mentors for 250 episodes. That changes us. And here's the piece that I'm really interested in getting to with you, which is the distinction between this is information and knowledge versus this is how I've changed. Because one is information and the other is transformation, right? We can read the books and go, oh, and now we've got interesting stuff to puke out on people, or we've got the visceral exchange that takes place by somebody saying, Scott's changed. How have you changed as a result of all that?
See, this is why Dove Barron's podcast is so popular, because he does the hard work to research guests, to watch and listen to their podcast, to read their books, to formulate profound questions like that. I'm kinder because I'm not a naturally kind person. I'm a loyal person. I'm a generous person. I'm a forgiving person, but kind is not a word people would use. Top 5 words. I'm not mean. I'm just not kind by nature. I'm kinder. I'm a little more patient. I pick my battles more carefully. Not everything is urgent. Not everything has to happen right now, today. I'm a little more thoughtful about that, a little more deliberate, a little more contemplative. I'm definitely more self-aware. I mean, you can't have interviewed the top 10 psychologists in the nation or the top 10, business leaders and not be a little more thoughtful. You can't interview Ariana Huffington and beat Deepak Chopra and Liz Wiseman and Grant Cardone and not come away, Ryan Holiday, a little more thoughtful around how am I living my life? What is my purpose? What is my mission? What do I want my boys to remember about me today? How do I make my wife look forward to me coming home versus dread me coming home at 5 o'clock after she's done 5 loads of laundry and walked the dogs 3 times and not had a meaningful conversation beyond a 7-year-old today? I think I am a better person all around because of my increased self-awareness. What's it like to be married to me? What's it like to produce a podcast with me? What's it like to be interviewed by me? What's it like to have the phone ring and my name be on the other end and me tell you what I'm frustrated about today with you?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm much more mindful of how I show up and how I want my interaction to be remembered by others. I think before the podcast, I was a bit of a force of nature.
Mm-hmm.
I'm often described as being ferocious, and that is sometimes a compliment and sometimes not.
Mm-hmm.
So I am like you on the receiving end of a tidal wave of insight from all these interviews.
Of course.
And I'm trying to be a model of deploying it into my own life.
That's beautiful. Thank you. I really appreciate that, because again, I'm a deep believer in information is worth the hole in the donut. Transformation comes from the application of that information. And that transformation is not possible. That application is not possible without self-awareness. And there are many people who are very wise, but no, let me rephrase that. There are many people who are very knowledgeable, but they're not very wise. And there's a distinction is, are you using this stuff? Do you actually get it? And not at an intellectual, but a deeply emotional level that has challenged you to look into that dark mirror, to the parts of yourself that are, and I think, thank you for saying this, because I think it's really important, things that are very easy to take as compliments that you must look at from the other side, so that, ferocious, I think was the word you said, that is like, if you're a dog with a bone around something you need to get done, you need that ferocity. But if you're trying to guide your children, you probably don't want that too much. You want a little bit
give feedback to a member of your team whose personality and the way in which they listen is different than yours. Providing feedback in a ferocious manner is going to have the opposite impact than your intention.
Exactly. So thank you for that, because the reason I've asked you these questions is very simple. Is because the book is Master Mentors, but what you've just outlined is how to mentor. So thank you for that. Thank you very much for that. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Doug.
We are already at the end of part 1 of the show. It's awesome. Thank you so much. So I want to give you a chance to tell people where they can find out more about you. We're going to come back with part 2 of this delicious conversation with Scott Miller and talking about his book, Master Mentors, and book series, rather, Master Mentors. And we're going to dive a little deeper into some of these subjects. I know you're going to love it, so stay tuned. Before we go away, Scott, please tell people where they can find out more about you, about this book, about book series, about your podcast, and about the 9 other million things that you are doing.
Well, dovebaron.com, because I plan to be all over that new site. I love the fact that on your website, you are a perfect example of having an abundance mentality. You spotlight all of the people that you've had in your podcast and lifting them up. And I love that you model exactly what we're talking about today. So my website, scottjeffreymiller.com, JEFFREY. You can visit it like Dove. My site has all of my columns from Inc. magazine, my LinkedIn post, all of the podcast episodes, my books. ScottJeffreymiller.com will give you more than a fair dose of things going on in my world. More than you want, I'm trusting.
Yeah, you will be faced with a tsunami of Scott Miller.
Scott Miller.
So take a big breath and dive in. We are going to be back in one click. Until then, stay curious, my friends. Stay curious about how you need mentors, but how you, whether you know it or not, are actually mentoring. So there's a need for you to be self-aware, to be conscious about how you're having impact. We're going to be back in just one click for more of our delicious conversation with Scott Miller. Stay curious, my friends. Stay curious.